You know, in life, we don't always get to choose how things turn out, right? Outcomes are sometimes rather surprising. And we hear her story, 13-year-old girl losing her arm. Pretty powerful, traumatic experience. And yet, she seems to have come around to the place where she sees God's glory being given through it. And somehow it was a positive. It's turned out to be a positive thing in her life, which is pretty amazing. You know, when we are able to look at outcomes and be able to look back and say, God, you're an amazing God. I never would have chosen this, but in light of what's happened, I just praise and glorify you. That's the same story of a character that we're going to look at today. He went through a mental illness challenge, a struggle, but it actually turned him around and brought him to God. And I want to tell you a little bit about his story this morning as we look into things. So we're in a series simply called Outcomes, and it's really a recognition that there are a lot of things that are outside of our control. And God is at work, and we just need to trust Him when challenges, troubles, and difficulties come along our way. And so last week we started into the story. We looked at Daniel, and we saw that he ended up getting thrown into a den of lions. It was not something he would have chose to have happened to him, but he recognized that no matter what, he was going to remain faithful to God, and come what may, he was going to just trust that God would work it out. In his case, he was preserved. It doesn't always happen. It didn't happen with Bethany. She lost an arm, but still was able to praise God. Today we're going to look at a guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. And the surprising thing about him is he was a king, a very powerful king, and he had known Daniel for about 20 years. Daniel had been taken as a captive out of his homeland in Israel, brought over to Babylon, and he was re-educated and given a position in the government, and he rose up and did well in the ranks. Excuse me. And for 20 years, he's been serving King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, from the Jewish perspective, when the Jews would look at that situation, they would say, us being captured by the Babylonians was evidence that God was punishing us. That's the way they viewed it. This was punishment for us turning our backs on God. From the Babylonian perspective, the way they looked at that situation, the fall of Jerusalem and everything, they would say, our God Marduk is stronger than your God in Israel. And that's the way they would view the situation, because we won. We were the dominant ones. We conquered. And so a very different way of looking at that same situation. However, Nebuchadnezzar learned a lesson. He needed to learn, because he was a great king. In fact, probably the greatest in the world at the time. He was a conqueror. There was blood on his hands. Many people had died as his armies had moved around the world. He was a builder. He was known, one of the ancient 7 world wonders of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, that he was the constructor behind. So you look at what he did. He had accomplished a lot. He had a lot to be proud of. And he was powerful. There was no one like him on the earth at the time. But this is what he says. And I'm talking about the outcomes. I want to go to the end of the story and read a verse from the end of chapter 4. He says this: Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the God of heaven. You say, how did he get there? How does the strongest, most influential, most powerful man on the face of the earth become a follower of God? Recognize that the God of heaven is actually the sovereign one. He defeated the nation of Israel. He must have felt like, we were greater. Our God, Marduk, is greater than this God of Israel. But then he did a 180 and realized, no, the God of heaven is the true God who's worthy of our praise. And so I exalt and glorify the King of heaven. Well, how did he get there? Well, let's go back and take a look at his story. It starts in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 4. It says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at my home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I'm in a happy state. Things have gone well. The battles have gone well. Relative time of peace now. Life is good. I'm contented and prosperous. I had a dream, and he tells this dream in his story. I had this dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in my bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So there was more than one. There seems to be a number of these visions and that kept bombarding him. More than probably some random nightmare. Maybe a night terror, but it's something that he just couldn't shake and stuck with him. And there was more than one. And so I commanded, in verse 6, I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. I needed to get some answers here. In that culture, in that day and age, people put a lot of stock in their dreams. What is the spirit world trying to say to me? And so he calls in all these wise men and says, tell me what the dream. But no one could interpret the dream. And then Daniel, he invited Daniel in. And he describes him as a guy who had the Spirit of the living God in him. And he had a confidence that Daniel could tell him. But Daniel needs to know what the dream is. So Daniel asks, tell me the dream. And so he explains the dream beginning in verse 10. It says, there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. This is the biggest tree you can imagine. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky and was visible and to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From every creature was fed. So it was a life-giving tree, a provider of shade and food for nature. He goes on, in the vision, I saw, while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, an angel, a messenger, coming down from heaven. He called out in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots remain in the ground, in the grass of the land. Let him be... He said, wait, there's a pronoun here. Let the tree, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times 7 pass by for him. And he finds this a terrifying dream, because he gets the sense that it has something to do with him. And then this final messenger gives this final statement. It says, the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. So he kind of summarizes this dream with a sense of purpose. That there is a sovereign God who gives authority to even the humblest. And this is a dream. Now, if I was asked, I could probably take a good shot at interpreting that dream. And you probably could too. So why is this so difficult? Maybe it's not that they can't. Maybe they just don't want to be the one to even suggest what it might mean. Anyway, so that's the dream. It goes on. This is the dream, he says, that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now Belteshazzar. Now this is what he called Daniel. This was his Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me, what is it? Tell me what it means. For none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can. There's confidence because he says it again, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now Daniel himself, when he hears it, he gets afraid. He's terrified. He's not sure he wants to tell the king what it means too. It seems pretty obvious. And then in the next few verses, Nebuchadnezzar has to comfort him. He says, Daniel, it's okay. Just tell me, what does it mean? And Daniel explains in verse 19. He says, my Lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries, but it's not. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals and having nesting place in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. Well, what about the messenger cutting the tree? Yeah, you again. He goes on, you will be driven away from the people, and you will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like an ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms of the earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. But there's some good news. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. When you acknowledge that heaven rules. You know, I think of a championship team that's just won the World Series or the Super Bowl, Stanley Cup. You know, they cheer, they raise it up. They're like, we are the champions. We rule. We are the best. We're number one, right? Well, there's that feeling with Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, they have conquered everybody. They're at the top. And God says, no, heaven rules, not you. You don't get to pick your outcomes. There is a sovereign God, and are you willing to acknowledge it? To rule means to be sovereign, to control, to be able to control the outcomes. And many situations, especially for powerful people, they can control many areas in life. But not all. And when God makes a decision that you can't change, that becomes extremely frustrating for a powerful person. But an important lesson to learn. Are you willing to say, yes, heaven rules? Heaven rules. We had a tragedy this week here in Ottawa. Guy by the name of Jeff Dean. Some of you even know him personally. He died in a skydiving accident. And he was known as a great skydiver. He started at skydiving school, jumped many times, lived in the Dunrobin area. He was, they called him a skydiving icon, right? He ruled the skies. Some of the, and I thought about, as great as he was at that, even he couldn't control that outcome on the fateful day. Outcomes sometimes surprise us. They come at bad times. And sometimes we try to control them, and there are things that in your life that you would desperately wish you could change. An outcome that just feels like, I wish there was something I could do about this. How do I handle this? And what Nebuchadnezzar has to learn is that he can't control everything. There is a king even higher than he. Now Daniel jumps in and takes an advisory role and gives King Nebuchadnezzar some advice in the next verse where he says, "Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice." Here it is. "Renounce your sin by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." It may be that your prosperity will continue if you'll acknowledge that heaven rules. Right? Turn from your wickedness. Take care of the oppressed. Well, I guess Nebuchadnezzar was pretty scared about this dream, but not scared enough to change. Because it says in the next verse that 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? You can almost hear the music started to change. Right? And it says in the next verse, "Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is declared for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you." And why was it taken? Because it could be taken. Because it was given in the first place. It was a loan. He didn't, he doesn't own it. His authority was given to him from above. Your royal authority has been taken from you. And immediately, what had happened, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. Immediately it was fulfilled. Some people have suggested that this is Boanthropy, an illness where people felt that they were something different than they were. And there's all kinds of situations where people think different of themselves, and some people think they're fatter than they are, or maybe a different gender than they are, or whatever. There's lots of different things that affect people. And this was a case where Nebuchadnezzar thought he was an animal. It's weird. It's not common, although I did look it up on the internet, and there are some examples. This girl was a picture. I guess she thinks she's a cow, and she eats grass. And there are some examples of people. There are even groups of people that get together and act out animal parts, and because they feel like there's an animal in them that they want to bring out. And it's a little. It seems a little different to me or strange, but that's this was something Nebuchadnezzar was struck with, and maybe one day his wife came into the palace and saw him on all fours, and couldn't communicate. We're not exactly sure what happened. Maybe took him out to the lawn and outside to give him some fresh air, and he got down and started eating the grass, and he's like, what's going on? Probably kept him protected. He was still the king, but he sure was acting strange. And for quite a while, we don't know what 7 times means, 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, or years. We're not sure. But for a period of time, he was in this state. It goes on to say in the next verse, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, and he's telling his own story. Daniel's recording this, but this is from the words of his mouth. He says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. Even this mental illness that I've just gone through, he's willing to say all his ways are just. He knows what he's doing. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. There's some things here that I think are good for us to acknowledge as we read this story. We read his testimony of his faith and his journey of coming to faith in God, which is pretty powerful, pretty impressive given his resume. But there's some things that I think we would be good to note. And the first one, I'll give both of them to you. The King of heaven rules. Very clearly, the first thing we need to acknowledge is that there is a king in heaven who rules, and outcomes are his. And the second thing is our influence or our leadership, whether it be family or friends or at work or wherever, our influence is a temporary stewardship that should be handled humbly. There's three things there. It's a temporary, and it's temporary because we're temporary. But it can be even more temporary than that, because it's a stewardship, which means it's given to us and it can be taken back from us. We are stewards. We don't use that word very often. It's an older word. A steward was someone who represented the king or was given a responsibility to handle some of the king's work. This influence is a stewardship. We've been given a stewardship. Even our family. Think about it. Your kids are a gift from God. A stewardship, a responsibility. They can be even taken away. Your influence is temporary. It's a stewardship that should be handled with humility. I think one of the things that Nebuchadnezzar learned through this is, despite all his background, despite his resume, he had to recognize that heaven rules, that there is an authority above him, that he is accountable, and he can take it away. He can inflict us with a difficulty, a problem, a mental illness, a struggle of some sort. But the King of heaven rules. There's a song that it's a new favorite of mine. I came across it a little while ago. It's called His Name is Jesus. It's by Phil Wickham. We've done some other of his songs. And I just heard it a month ago, and it stuck in my head. And this week, as I came across it again, and I sat down and played it over and over a number of times. And I just sat there and I just let it sort of sink in, the words of this song, because we just talked about heaven rules. Well, this song gives name to who is the King of heaven. Well, his name is Jesus. You see, Daniel's story was 580 years before Jesus was even born. So this testimony from Nebuchadnezzar before Jesus even walked on the earth. But he learned that there was a king in heaven. And then one day that king came down to earth and walked and lived among us. And his name is Jesus. He's the rightful king. There's a couple of lines in the song that really gripped me. One is the very first one. It says, The king is in the room. It's the first line in the song. And it kind of makes you stop and realize, you think of the great king, the king above all kings, but he's right here in the room with us. It's a powerful thought. He was with Nebuchadnezzar, but he's here with us today. The king is in the room. And the other one, the other line in the song you'll see, it says, name another king like this. Just try to name another king like this. Can you think of another king? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was maybe the greatest, one of the great kings of the world. Was he anything like King Jesus? Or what about Alexander the Great, who came a few years after Nebuchadnezzar? Wow, he had an impressive kingship. He took over the world. Was he the great king? No, doesn't hold a candle to the King of Kings. All the pharaohs that ever lived, or the Caesars that ever ruled, or the prime ministers, there is only one real king. And the King of Kings, what is his name? His name is Jesus.